This is Hans Krebs, who in 1937 published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions, by which energy is released in individual cells. It is called the Krebs cycle, which some of you may remember from your chemistry course in your high school. Krebs is a wonderful example to me of how a scientist who is determined can overcome all kinds of human obstacles. Krebs' father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence whenever to anything important in his life, as a teenager. What Krebs remembers in his memoir, his father said to him, "You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." And later on, when Krebs studied with the great biochemist Otto Warburg, Warburg also told him the same thing. Not the same quote, but that he had only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. And we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children, but sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.
Hans Krebs published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions, by which energy is released in individual cells. To begin with, Krebs' father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence whenever to anything important in his life, as a teenager. Moreover, he had the only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. Overall, we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children, but sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.
Our civilization, which subsumes most of its predecessors, is a great ship steaming at speed into the future. It travels faster, further, and more laden than any before. We may not be able to foresee every reef and hazard, but by reading her compass bearing and headway, by understanding her design, her safety record, and the abilities of her crew, we can, I think, plot a wise course between the narrows and bergs looming ahead. And I believe we must do this without delay, because there are too many shipwrecks behind us. The vessel we are now aboard is not merely the biggest of all time, it is also the only one left. The future of everything we have accomplished since our intelligence evolved will depend on the wisdom of our actions over the next few years. Like all creatures, humans have made their way in the world so far by trial and error. Unlike other creatures, we have a presence so colossal that error is a luxury we can no longer afford. The world has grown too small to forgive,
The speaker was discussing civilization. To commence with, the speaker discusses the idea of civilization is like a ship and how it relates to the future. Furthermore, the speaker mentions one example about we cannot foresee the future, but there are safety records of the ship and the capability of its crew. Overall, a description of humans have made their way in the world so far by trial and error, but the world has grown too small to forgive us any big mistakes.
Hello, I'm David Brown, curator of Italian and Spanish paintings at the National Gallery of Art. The treasures in our exhibition, The Art of Power, Royal Armor and Portraits from Imperial Spain, come from the Royal Armoury in Madrid. They range from the 15th to the 17th century and include some of the finest examples of Renaissance armor in the world. Fabricated by master craftsmen and artists, the shields, helmets and armor were made for Holy Roman emperors, kings, and the flower of Spanish royalty. This is parade armor, made for show, not combat. In form, it looks back to a world tournaments, journalists and noble gesture. And among the images worked into the steel is something quite different, a subtle advertising campaign for the imperial ambitions of the Spanish monarchy and the Habsburg dynasty. Those who wore it took the words Holy, Roman and Empire very seriously.
The curator of the National Gallery of Art provides a brief introduction about the armor in their exhibition. To add further, the exhibition includes some finest examples of Renaissance armor, which were fabricated by master craftsmen and artists over the 15th–17th century. Parade armor was made for the show, not combat. That armor represents the imperial ambition of the Spanish monarchy.
Absolutely. There's a lot of interest in what forms those clouds. Why are those clouds there? Why do they stick around? At the center of every cloud, a drop is a particle. You can't grow a cloud drop without having a particle there for the water to condense on. The key question that people have not directly addressed until very recently is what actually forms those clouds. And so, the ones that you're looking at over the ocean, it turns out sea salt is a very effective nucleator for forming clouds, so there's a really good chance that those are loaded with sea salt. But as you go inland you start to have pollution come from all different kinds of sources, and so different sources form clouds more effectively than others. And we're trying to unravel which sources are actually contributing to the clouds. The clouds are incredibly important players in climate change in that they reflect the light back to space, and so they're keeping things much, much cooler than they would be if they weren't there. They also play a huge role in regional weather. So, we're actually starting to see shifts where having more pollution input into the clouds is affecting weather patterns, and in particular, it's actually reducing the amount of precipitation. So we're starting to see drought in areas with super high levels of air pollution. The lecturer was discussing the formation of clouds. First and foremost, she talked about cloud drop, which contains a particle. Furthermore, if you're looking out at over the ocean, turns out sea spray, sea salt is a very effective nucleus for forming clouds. But if you go inland, you start to have pollution come from all kinds of places, and so different sources form clouds more effectively than others. Overall, the speaker says that the clouds play a huge role to affect the weather patterns. Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life and innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. And he knew that the great cultures of Europe were there. He was not a product of a narrow American studies kind of training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much a part of life for everyone as conversation. He thought that Proust and Joyce and Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans, and helped that to happen. Wilson was a very various man over a period of almost 50 years. He was a dedicated literary journalist, an investigative reporter, a brilliant memoirist, and a dedicated journal keeper. In the lecture, the speaker mentions a person called Wilson. At the beginning of the lecture, the speaker says that he comes from a very different world and is the focal point in American culture. According to the speaker, he believes that literature a part of life for everyone as for conversation. Lastly, the speaker indicates that in over 50 years, he is a dedicated literary journalist.
A leader can define or clarify goals by issuing a memo or an executive order, an edict or a fatwa or a tweet, by passing a law, barking a command, or presenting an interesting idea in a meeting of colleagues. Leaders can mobilize people's energies in ways that range from subtle, quiet persuasion to the coercive threat or the use of deadly force. Sometimes a charismatic leader such as Martin Luther King Jr. can define goals and mobilize energies through rhetoric and the power of example. We can think of leadership as a spectrum, in terms of both visibility and the power the leader wields. On one end of the spectrum, we have the most visible, authoritative leaders like the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or a dictator such as Hitler or Gaddafi. At the opposite end of the spectrum is casual, low-key leadership found in countless situations every day around the world, leadership that can make a significant difference to the individuals whose lives are touched by it. Over the centuries, the first kind, the out in front, authoritative leadership, has generally been exhibited by men. Some men in positions of great authority, including Nelson Mandela, have chosen a strategy of leading from behind. More often, however, top leaders have been quite visible in their exercise of power. Women, as well as some men, have provided casual, low-key leadership behind the scenes. But this pattern has been changing, as more women have taken up opportunities for visible, authoritative leadership. The speaker was discussing leadership in detail. To initiate with, leaders can mobilize people's energies in ways that range from subtle, quiet persuasion to the coercive threat or the use of deadly force. Leadership is a spectrum, in terms of both visibility and the power the leader wields. Leadership can make a significant difference to the individuals whose lives are touched by it. Overall, top leaders have been quite visible in their exercise of power.
The Skoog is a new university-accessible musical instrument. It is designed to use by children or adults with special needs or in fact be used by anyone. It's soft, it's easy to play, it's robust and it can be customized to suit anyone's abilities. The Skoog helps students with special needs by allowing them to get involved in making music themselves. It's an instrument that they can play it and they can take ownership of and start creating their own sounds and music. Traditional instruments are the shape and size and made of the materials they are because of the sound that they need to make. If you want to make a sound like a plucked string, you need a string and it needs to be under tension, whereas with a Skoog, because it's a mixture of software and a sensor, then thus the computer can handle making the sound. And so we can design an object that's designed to be touched and designed to be played with. In developing the screen and working with kids in the schools and in the classrooms, it's really helped us make the Skoog something that's usable by the children themselves. They've informed us massively on how it needs to work and they've given their opinions on colors and designs. And just the feedback they've given to us has been just marvelous. It's just so enriching and it's really inspiring to actually work with these kids, particularly when you can provide them with an ability to start to play their own music as opposed to just taking part through listening and listening to other musicians and really learning from. This lecture is about Skoog, which is a new musical instrument designed for children or adults with special needs. It allows students to get involved in making music themselves. It is different from traditional instruments. Traditional instruments are the shape and size and made of the materials they are because of the sound that they need to make. While the Skoog is a mixture of software and a sensor, thus the computer can handle making the sound. The feedback is very positive. It is enriching and inspiring, and children found it usable and found the color and design attractive.
You can see that the two charts, each give quite a different picture of the performance of boys and girls in the two key subjects of maths and English. It shows that in English, girls consistently outperform boys over a period of 6 years, achieving scores about 10% above their male peers. There is quite a different picture when we look at the math results with no real difference between genders in the results. What is the explanation for these key differences? To answer this question, researchers look at biological and cognitive factors and a range of social factors. The interaction between these different components in early childhood development is seen as maintained and reinforced in the school context. And this leads to distinct gender patterns of behavior and skills with direct consequences for school performance and achievement. The ultimate uses of this evidence are to show that biological factors, such as patterns of cognitive developments, are closely linked to social factors, such as learned gender categories. These cognitive skills are learned both preschool and subsequently at school, supported by the responses of teachers, creating a reinforcement of patterns. The lecturer was discussing the performance of boys and girls in English and mathematics. First and foremost, he talked about girls who usually outperform boys in English than boys over the first 6 years, while there is no significant difference in maths. In addition to this, there are 3 reasons to explain this: biological, social factors, and preschool factors. Overall, I would like to opine that girls' pattern recognizing abilities are better than boys.
It is wrong, however, to exaggerate the similarity between language and other cognitive skills, because language stands apart in several ways. For one thing, the use of language is universal. All normally developing children learn to speak at least one language, and many learn more than one. By contrast, not everyone becomes proficient at complex mathematical reasoning, few people learn to paint well, and many people cannot carry a tune. Because everyone is capable of learning to speak and understand language, it may seem to be simple. But just the opposite is true. Language is one of the most complex of all human cognitive abilities.
The lecture talks about the differences between language learning and other cognitive skills learning. The use of language is universally used, and all developing children learn to speak at least one language, even more than one. Not everyone becomes proficient at other cognitive skills, such as mathematical reasoning, painting, or carrying a tune. The universal use of language makes it capable of learning simply. Language is one of the most complex human cognitive skills.
Thermodynamics is the science of the flow of heat. So, thermo is heat, and dynamic is the motion of heat. Thermodynamics was developed largely beginning in the 1800s, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, taming of steel. The beginning of generating power by burning fossil fuels. The beginning with the problems with carbon dioxide and global warming. In fact, it's interesting to note that the first calculation on the impact of carbon dioxide on climate was done in the late 1800s by Arrhenius. Beginning of a generation of power moving heat from fossil fuels to generating energy, locomotives, etc. So, he calculated what would happen to this burning of fossil fuels, and he decided in his calculation. He basically got the calculation right, by the way, but he came out that in 2000 years from the time that he did the calculations, the human would be in trouble. The lecturer was delineating the thermodynamics in detail. To begin with, thermodynamics is about heat and temperature transmission and their relation to energy and work. In addition to this, thermodynamics was developed largely beginning in the 1800s, at the